Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are having a great week so far. We're going to kick it off with coalition updates. Our deadline for Bringing It Home workshop proposals has been extended to January 12th. So we're preparing for the 2024 Bringing It Home Conference on Ending Homelessness in North Carolina. This conference will take place on June 4th through the 5th in 2024, and it's in collaboration with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, ESG Office, the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness, and us, the North Carolina Housing Coalition. So we're calling for presentation proposals. Presentations will be around an hour and 15 minutes long, and that will include 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A or discussion. So presentations could be chosen as either standalone sessions or chosen as a part of a panel. At this time, we are planning an in-person conference at the McKimmon Center in Raleigh. So please note that these presentations need to include one or more of the topics on the topics of interest listed on the link that we'll include in the call notes. That also has the submission form for you. So if you're interested, make sure to check that out. Moving on to federal updates, we have a lot of federal updates. U.S. congressional lawmakers continue to work on passing spending bills by the new deadlines that were recently set by the latter CR signed into law on November 15th. The Senate has passed 3 of the 12 annual spending bills, including the T-HUD bill that includes housing. The House has passed 7 spending bills, but both chambers have very different funding levels for federal programs, particularly around housing. So some of those key differences I'm going to highlight for you really quick. In the Senate, the T-HUD bill for fiscal 24 includes a $70.06 billion allocation for HUD's affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs, which is an increase of about $8.26 billion over fiscal 23 levels. And in the House fiscal 24 draft for T-HUD, it's funded at $68.2 billion, which is a 10% or $6.4 billion increase over fiscal 23 levels. But the House version also includes proposed deep cuts and the elimination of several HUD programs. So we know, and we've been saying this, that any cuts in any form, including just maintaining current spending levels, will lead to people losing access to their critical housing resources and services and put thousands of people and their households at risk. There's also been new research released from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that estimates that about 40,000 vouchers would expire upon turnover if the House's funding levels are what are implemented. So I'm going to say that number again, 40,000 housing vouchers would expire if the House version of the T-HUD bill, that those funding levels are implemented and those cuts are implemented. And an estimated 6,000 vouchers would be lost upon turnover if the Senate funding levels are implemented. So 6,000. Neither number is acceptable. In order to maintain the current level of services and fully renew all existing voucher contracts, this will require at least $27.84 billion for vital HUD voucher programs. So we'll have a link to the awesome folks at National Low Income Housing Coalition. They have a great sort of resource about the federal spending conversations happening this week, but also that highlight how much is actually needed. Top congressional leaders are also working really quickly to reach a bipartisan agreement before the end of the year to expand the child tax credit and also revive several different business tax incentives. And if successful, this tax package could also include resources to expand the low-income housing tax credit program. So we have a few different federal advocacy engagement opportunities for you all. The first, as we encourage you all to contact your senators and representatives and urge them to continue to expand, but not cut investments in affordable, accessible homes through the fiscal 24 spending bill. It needs to include full funding for several of the following priorities that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has and that we agree with. So there needs to be full funding to renew all existing contracts for the tenant-based rental assistance and project-based rental assistance programs, full funding for public housing operations and repairs. The Senate proposed funding for homeless assistance grants, and then protecting the $20 million in funding for legal assistance to prevent evictions in the Senate bill, and then the House's proposed funding for Native housing. So there are some pieces of each that are decent, but still we need to make sure that this budget does not lead to thousands of people being left without their housing. So you can sign on to a national letter in addition to contacting your representatives, calling on Congress to support the highest level of funding possible for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development resources in fiscal 24. You can also encourage your members to include any end-of-year tax package, but make sure that it includes LIHTC reforms that are outlined in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2023, so that that program can better serve those in need. So we want you to contact your members, but especially, and we'll have these committees linked in the call notes, if you have any members that are on the Senate Finance Committee or House Ways and Means Committee, to urge them to ensure that any new LIHTC resources can reach households experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So ask your members of Congress to pair any extension of the LIHTC with key bipartisan reforms that includes expanding the basis boost, known as extremely low income ELI basis boost, for housing developments that set aside at least 20% of units for households with extremely low incomes or for those experiencing homelessness. And then also communicate with them about designating tribal and rural communities as difficult to develop areas, DDAs, which would make it more financially feasible for developers to build affordable homes in these areas. So we've included several links about these priorities to the Senate Finance Committee, House and Ways and Means Committee, as well as a great resource from the Action Campaign around the impact of the low-income housing tax credit in our state. So there's a fact sheet and several resources there for you to use as you contact your senators and representatives and continue to urge them to expand and not cut funding for housing, homelessness, and community development. Last week, we released the CRA resource titled Diving into the CRA Final Rule Update, where we provided some background on the CRA and summarized some of the key points related to the final rule update. And we wanted to try and connect this process to affordable housing and community development a bit more. So this is the second engagement opportunity. If you are interested in learning more about how to engage banks in your community or region and housing and community development activities, or you have questions about how to do so and are interested in learning more from professionals that have a lot more experience in CRA and community development, please email me at swatkinscruz@nchousing.org. And also email me if you are a member of an organization that submitted comments on the CRA final rule, or if you've reflected a bit on how these changes do or do not accomplish what the original purpose of the law set out to do. So please email me your thoughts. I would love to get a conversation going and highlight some of the outcomes of that conversation, perhaps on a housing call next year. A recent memo from Novogradac does a great job, of course, highlighting that final CRA regulations provide new opportunities for affordable housing and community development. And this memo takes it a bit further and talks about how the CRA rule can be impactful even beyond the low-income housing tax credit. In other federal news, yesterday, some great news, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition announced that a transformative $15 million gift from philanthropist Mackenzie Scott was made. So congratulations to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This is the largest gift in their almost 50-year history. That's $15 million. That's amazing. And that's going to do some really great work. HUD also proposed a 30-day notice rule. So this is another engagement opportunity. So there's 3 federal engagement opportunities. On Friday last week, HUD published a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register that would require housing authorities and owners of properties participating in any HUD project-based rental assistance program to give tenants at least 30 days notice prior to filing an eviction for non-payment of rent. The notice would also include instructions on how to cure the non-payment violation, recertify income in the event that the household experienced a decrease in income, and request a minimum rent hardship exemption. Public comment is open on this proposed rule until late January. This is also one of the strategies as part of the White House blueprint for a renter bill of rights. So we encourage you to support the 30-day notice rule and have included a link with the proposed rule as well as instructions on how to submit a comment in our call notes. Moving on to state updates, Medicaid expansion went into effect on December 1st and allowed for approximately 600,000 additional North Carolina residents to be eligible for health care automatically. So we've included a lot of different links in our call notes to help understand what does this mean. Is 600,000 people, is that the only number of people that might now be eligible for health care? The answer is no, even more people might be eligible for health care. So there are a lot of different resources out there that have been released both at the state level and different news organizations that discuss Medicaid expansion and the great impact that we know it will have for folks in our community. State election filing for 2024 contests began yesterday, December 4th. So these contests include all 14 of the state's congressional seats, the governor's race, the attorney general's race, 8 other statewide races that also include the lieutenant governor, the state auditor, and state treasurer, as well as a seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court, and 3 seats on the North Carolina Court of Appeals, as well as all 170 state, house, and senate races, and several other really important local races across the state. So have a link to that in the call notes. There are several folks that are still making decisions, and so we'll make sure to keep an eye on how that goes, particularly with the new maps that have been released. State legislative updates. So North Carolina General Assembly lawmakers returned last Wednesday and will convene about 5 or 6 more times between now and April 2024. Just briefly, which is when they'll start the short session at the end of April 2024, actually April 24th. The short session is typically the season held in the second even year of the biennium, and during this session, only certain matters can be considered, and are typically outlined in the adjournment resolution that is voted on in order to determine their eligibility. So we've linked that adjournment resolution for you all on the call notes. A matter can also be considered if it's authorized by a joint resolution passed by a 2/3 vote of each chamber's members present and voting. We're going to continue to monitor the bills discussed during the short session, especially the ones that we have already included in our bill tracker that we know survives crossover, as well as any bills directly affecting the state budget and other key matters that impact housing and community development. So we've included the adjournment resolution, the legislative memo that talks about the continuing schedule for the General Assembly, the short session, and then the crossover bills that are eligible for consideration during the short session. And then we're also going to include a list of 2023 through 2024 legislation that has effective dates starting from July 1st of this year through January 1st of 2024. Just want to, keep reminding folks that there is legislation coming into effect consistently, almost every month, right, between July and January. So there's a lot still happening, and we're keeping an eye on it. Moving on to local community updates. I told y'all this was a little bit of a long one. Affordable housing is coming to Murphy. Valley River Apartments are to broke ground on December 1st. The Western North Carolina Housing Partnership and the town of Murphy hosted a groundbreaking ceremony last week for a workforce housing development that is financed in part by housing tax credits and the Workforce Housing Loan Program, and has additional support from the Department of Commerce, the Dogwood Health Trust, the Rural Economic Development Division, and the CDBG program. So the Workforce Housing Loan Program, which is funded by the General Assembly, has assisted over 70 tax credit projects after a record $190 million allocation last year. Unfortunately, that is not the same level it would be funded at next year and the year after that. But I think 70 different tax credit projects. That just goes to show how critical and how wonderful that state resource is. Senator Michael Lee signed a check for Castle Hayne affordable senior housing. He attended a check signing ceremony last week in Castle Hayne, where the funds from the state workforce loan program are helping to bridge a financing gap for senior affordable housing. This project was awarded tax credits in 2020 and, like many, faced difficulties making the math work after pandemic era increases in construction costs and inflation. The next piece, there's a lot happening out in Dare County. WODA Cooper actually ends their housing efforts in Dare County. The Affordable Housing Development Company, WODA Cooper, announced last week that they were ending efforts to build workforce housing in partnership with Dare County. The company cited the obstacles resulting from community pushback as a reason, and as we've discussed in the previous housing calls, actually, WODA Cooper's efforts to build workforce housing in Dare County were actually halted twice this year. In Manio, WODA Cooper's plans to build workforce housing on county-owned land were halted when the Manio commissioners voted to not tie the project into the town sewer system. And previously in Nags Head, the zoning code was actually changed to effectively eliminate, multifamily housing after they announced plans to build workforce housing. The state legislature allocated $35 million to Dare County to build new affordable housing, but the contractor hired by the county to build a 400-unit development has faced opposition over the locations that it's considering for the project. To date, that developer, Coastal Affordable Housing LLC, is the only affordable housing still working with the county. But in October, the 6 municipalities within Dare County jointly filed a lawsuit against the state after a provision was added to the state budget that exempts affordable housing projects funded by the state from local zoning regulations. So House Speaker Tim Moore actually confirmed that the provision was added at the request of legislators from the area to overcome issues with zoning. But meanwhile, Dare County and other coastal communities are still experiencing hiring difficulties due to the high cost of living and lack of affordable options for service industry workers, teachers, police, and other essential workers. So a lot happening out on the eastern part of our state. In reports and resources, we have a lot there for you really quickly. I'll just mention some key ones. The Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University released their Housing America's Older Adults 2023 report. And the report found that seniors are struggling to pay for housing and accessible services in order to remain in their homes while relying on a fixed income, and that the cost of long-term care is out of reach for most older adults, and government assistance is insufficient to meet the growing needs. Renters and homeowners of color face steeper burdens, and that mortgage debt among older adults is rising, and the states favored by older adults, i.e. Florida, are experiencing the brunt of climate change-related disasters. In events, there are a few coming up. There's one today by the National Fair Housing Alliance and the Fair Share Housing Center from 3 to 4 p.m. It's a webinar talking about exclusionary zoning and dismantling discriminatory housing policies. And the National Alliance to End Homelessness is hosting a webinar tomorrow from 1 to 2 p.m. talking about elevating the needs of homeless service workers and finding some recent nationwide surveys. We have a lot of news pieces. I'll leave you all there since I've taken up a lot of your time already. If you have any questions about the federal advocacy engagement opportunities, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Talk to you next time.